And away we go. To those of you who celebrate, I hope you're having a lovely Christmas Eve. And to those of you who do not celebrate, or celebrate Hanukkah, or celebrate anything, or don't celebrate at all, I hope you're just having a lovely evening. I, of course, am an avowed atheist. Not the Ricky Gervais kind. The kind who doesn't really feel the need to talk about it too much. Well, that's probably not true, is it? Good evening, Katerina and Jay. Jay and Jay. And Jacob. Willow. Warpraven. Hope you're feeling a little better. I know it's way too early to really feel any better. Lexi. So, once upon a time, I was doing a podcast, and it was brought to my attention. A book was brought to my attention that somehow had slipped. I don't know how it got by me for as long as it did. As a Dostoevsky fan and a fan of Russian literature, I somehow had not read The Master and Margarita. There was someone watching from Russia. This is pre the Ukraine, or the most recent Ukraine debacle war. Václav was his name. He directed me to the book, and I read it, and I was hooked. And in one of the earlier chapters, let's say the devil speaks to a poet and a publisher, and gives an account of what happened in Judea on that fateful day when the wandering vagrant, as he was called, came before the procurator, the governor of Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate. So, and yes, Lexi, right? Like, I've not heard from him, and I hope that he is doing well. There were a few people, Russian citizens, who would pop by, one of whom did a lot of the artwork, did my profile picture, and a lot of artwork for the podcast channel. And I hear from them occasionally. I think they're okay. But it's difficult. It must be difficult. So there's a chapter in the book that is this recounting by the devil. And I say the devil because I don't want to really give away much about the book. And I found it to be fascinating. So doing this in full sort of Christmas mode, of slow fades from scene to scene, of a star obscured by my right microphone. But I'm just going to jump in and start reading. If anybody has any questions about anything or wants to talk about anything, I'll be happy to do that. but probably not while I'm reading. While I'm reading, I will occasionally look to be sure that there's not any kind of audio issues going on. But anyway, the title of the chapter is Pontius Pilate. So let's get started with this Christmas story. I think y'all will like it. Are the sides switched? Let me remedy that. If the sides are switched for you all now, how about now? This is the inverse of what it was, so I'm assuming this will be the right sides for you all. I seem to have this problem a lot when I'm broadcasting live. Can't seem to get my left and my right correct. Alright, so here it is. Chapter is called Pontius Pilate. This is from Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. In a white cloak with a blood-red lining, with the shuffling gait of a cavalryman, early in the morning, the 14th day of the spring month of Nisan, there emerged into the covered colonnade between the two wings of the palace of Herod the Great, the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. More than anything else on earth, the procurator hated the smell of attar and roses, and everything now betokened a bad day ahead, for that smell had been haunting the procurator since dawn. It seemed to the procurator that the smell of roses was being emitted by the cypresses and palms in the garden, and that mingling with the smell of his escort's leather accoutrement and sweat was an accursed waft of roses. From the wings at the rear of the palace that quartered the 12th Lightning Legion's first cohort, which had come to Jerusalem with the procurator, a puff of smoke carried across the upper court of the garden into the colonnade, and with this rather acrid smoke which testified to the fact that the cooks in the centuries had started preparing dinner, was mingling still that same heavy odor of roses. Oh, gods, why do you punish me? No, there's no doubt. This is it. This is it again, the invincible, terrible sickness, hemicrania. When half my head is aching, there are no remedies for it, no salvation whatsoever. I'll try to keep my head still. On the mosaic floor by the fountain, an armchair had already been prepared, and the procurator sat down in it, without looking at anyone, and reached a hand out to one side. Into that hand, his secretary deferentially placed a piece of parchment. Unable to refrain from a grimace of pain, the procurator took a cursory sidelong glance through what was written, returned the parchment to the secretary, and said with some difficulty, "The man under investigation is from Galilee, is he? Was the case sent to the Tetrarch?" "Yes, procurator," replied the secretary. "And he did what?" "He refused to give a decision on the case, and sent the Sanhedrin's death sentence for your ratification," explained the secretary. The procurator pulled at his cheek and said quietly, "Bring the accused here." Immediately 2 legionnaires led a man of about 27 from the garden court and onto the balcony under the columns, and stood him in front of the procurator's armchair. The man was dressed in an old and ragged light blue chiton. His head was partly covered by a white cloth with a band around the forehead, and his hands were bound behind his back. Under his left eye, the man had a large bruise, and in the corner of his mouth there was the dried blood of a cut. The new arrival looked with uneasy curiosity at the procurator. The latter was silent for a while, then asked quietly in Aramean, "So it was you inciting the people to demolish the temple at Jerusalem?" While speaking, the procurator sat like stone, and only his lips moved a tiny bit as he pronounced the words. The procurator was like stone because he was afraid to move his head. It was on fire with hellish pain. The man, with his hands bound, edged forward a little and began to speak. "Good man, believe me." But the procurator, immobile as before, and without raising his voice in the least, interrupted him right away. "Is it me you are calling a good man? You're mistaken. Everyone in Jerusalem whispers that I am a savage monster, and it's absolutely true." In the same monotone he added, "Centurion Ratcatcher to me." It seemed to everyone that the balcony grew darker when the centurion of the 1st century, Marcus, nicknamed the Ratcatcher, appeared before the procurator. The Ratcatcher was a head taller than the tallest of the legion's rank-and-file soldiers, and so broad in the shoulders that he completely blotted out the still low sun. The procurator addressed the centurion in Latin. "The criminal calls me a good man. Take him away for a minute. Explain to him how I should be spoken to. But don't mutilate him." And all except for the motionless procurator let their eyes follow Marcus the Ratcatcher, who had waved his arm at the man under arrest, indicating that the latter should follow him. The eyes of all generally followed the Ratcatcher whenever he appeared because of his height, and also for those who were seeing him for the first time, because of the fact that the centurion's face was disfigured. His nose had been broken by a blow from a Germanic cudgel. Marcus's heavy boots pounded across the mosaic. The bound man followed him noiselessly. Complete silence fell in the colonnade, and the doves in the garden court by the balcony could be heard cooing, while the water, too, sang an intricate, pleasant song in the fountain. The procurator felt like getting up. Felt like putting his temple under the jet of water and freezing like that. But he knew that would not help him either. Leading the prisoner out from under the columns into the garden, the Ratcatcher took the whip from the hands of a legionary who was standing by the pedestal of a bronze statue, and with a gentle swing struck the prisoner across the shoulders. The centurion's movement was insouciant and easy, but the bound man instantly collapsed to the ground as though his legs had been chopped out from under him. He choked on the air, the color drained from his face, and his eyes became senseless. Easily, with just his left hand, Marcus tugged the fallen man up into the air like an empty sack, set him on his feet, and began in a nasal voice, mispronouncing the Aramean words. "Call the Roman procurator Hegemon. No other words. Stand to attention. Do you understand me, or do I hit you?" The prisoner staggered, but controlled himself. The color returned. He took breath and answered hoarsely, I understand you. Don't beat me. A minute later, he was standing before the procurator once more. There was the sound of the flat, sick voice. Name? Mine? The prisoner responded hastily, his entire being expressing his readiness to answer sensibly and not provoke any more anger. In a low voice, the procurator said, I know mine. Don't pretend to be more stupid than you are. Yours. Yeshua, the prisoner replied hurriedly. Do you have another name? Ha-Nosri. Your place of birth? The town of Gamala, replied the prisoner, indicating with his head that over there, somewhere far away to his right in the north, lay the town of Gamala. What are you by blood? I don't know exactly, replied the prisoner animatedly. I don't remember my parents. I'm told my father was a Syrian. Where's your permanent home? I don't have any permanent place to live, replied the prisoner shyly. I travel from town to town. That can be expressed more briefly in a word. A vagrant, said the procurator and asked, do you have relatives? There's no one. I'm alone in the world. Are you literate? Yes. Do you know any other language than Aramean? I do. Greek. A swollen eyelid was raised. An eye clouded with suffering stared at the prisoner. The other eye remained closed. So Pilate began speaking in Greek. So it was you meaning to demolish the building of the temple and calling on the people to do it. At this point, the prisoner again became animated. His eyes ceased to express fright, and he began speaking in Greek. At this point there was a flash of horror in the prisoner's eyes, at having almost said the wrong thing. I, Hegemon, have never in my life meant to demolish the building of the temple, and I've not incited anyone to commit such a senseless act. Surprise expressed itself in the face of the secretary, who was hunched over a low table and recording the testimony. He raised his head, but immediately bent it down again towards the parchment. A host of people of various kinds throngs to the city for the feast. Among them there may be magi, astrologers, soothsayers, and murderers, said the procurator in a monotone. And liars may be found too. You, for example, are a liar. It's clearly recorded. Inciting to demolish the temple, such is the people's testimony. These good people, the prisoner began, hastily adding Hegemon, and continued. These good people learned nothing and muddled up everything I said. In general, I'm beginning to worry that this muddle work will continue for a very long time, and all because he records what I say incorrectly. Silence fell. By now, both painful eyes were looking hard at the prisoner. I repeat to you, for the last time, stop pretending to be mad, you villain, pronounced Pilate in a gentle monotone. Not a lot of what you've said is recorded, but what is recorded is enough to hang you. No, Hegemon, said the prisoner, his whole body tensing up in his desire to convince. He goes around. There's this one that goes around with goatskin parchment and writes incessantly. But once I took a glance at the parchment, I was horrified. I'd said absolutely nothing of what was recorded there. I begged him, for God's sake, won't you burn your parchment? But he tore it out of my hands and ran away. Who is this? Pilate asked with distaste. He put a hand up to his temple. Levi Matthew, explained the prisoner willingly. He was a tax collector. I met him first in the street, Bethphage, where the corner of the fig orchard sticks out. I got into a conversation with him. His initial attitude towards me was hostile. He even insulted me. That is, he thought he was insulting me by calling me a dog. Here the prisoner grinned. I personally see nothing bad about the animal to make me take offense at the word. The secretary stopped recording and cast a surreptitious look of surprise, not at the prisoner, but at the procurator. However, after listening to me, he began to soften, continued Yeshua. Finally, threw money down on the road and said he would come traveling with me. Pilate grinned with one cheek, baring his yellow teeth, and said, turning the whole of his trunk towards the secretary, "Oh, city of Yerushalayim, the things you hear in it. A tax collector, do you hear, throwing money into the road?" Not knowing how to reply to this, the secretary deemed it necessary to duplicate Pilate's smile. And he said that henceforth money was hateful to him, Yeshua said, explaining Levi Matthew's strange actions, and added, "And since then he's become my traveling companion." With his teeth still bared, the procurator glanced at the prisoner, then at the sun, which was steadily rising over the equestrian statues of the hippodrome, lying far below to the right, and suddenly, in a nauseating sort of anguish, he thought of how it would be simplest of all to banish this strange villain from the balcony by pronouncing just 2 words: hang him. To banish the escort, too. Leave the colonnade for the interior of the palace, order the room to be darkened, drop into the couch, demand some cold water, summon the dog, Banga, in a plaintive voice, and complain to him about the hemicrania. And a sudden thought about poison flashed seductively through the procurator's aching head. He looked at the prisoner with lackluster eyes and was silent for a while, agonizing as he tried to remember why, in the full blaze of Yerushalayim's pitiless morning sun, a prisoner with a face disfigured by blows was standing before him, and what other totally unnecessary questions he would have to ask. "Levi Matthew," the sick man asked in a hoarse voice, and closed his eyes. "Yes, Levi Matthew," came the high-pitched, tormenting voice. "What were you saying, after all, to the crowd at the bazaar about the temple?" The voice of the man answering seemed to stab into Pilate's brow. It was inexpressibly agonizing. The voice said, "I was saying, Hegemon, that the temple of the old faith would collapse, and a new temple of truth would be created. I put it like that so it would be clearer." "And why were you vagrant, stirring up the people at the bazaar, telling them about truth of which you have no conception? What is truth?" And at this point, the procurator thought, "Oh my God, I'm asking him about something unnecessary during the trial. My mind is not serving me anymore." And again he had a vision of a goblet, dark liquid. "Give me poison, poison." Once more he heard the voice. "The truth, first and foremost, is that your head aches, and aches so badly that you're faint-heartedly contemplating death. Not only do you not have the strength to talk to me, you find it hard to even look at me. And now I'm your involuntary torturer, which grieves me. You can't even think about anything. You dream only for the arrival of your dog, evidently the only creature you feel affection for. But your torment will come to an end in a moment. Your headache will disappear. The secretary stared, goggle-eyed, at the prisoner and stopped mid-word. Pilate raised his martyr's eyes to the prisoner and saw that the sun was already quite high above the hippodrome, and that a ray had stolen into the colonnade and was creeping towards Yeshua's worn-down sandals, and that he was trying to stay out of the sun. At this point, the procurator rose from his armchair, gripped his head in his hands, and on his yellowish, clean-shaven face, an expression of horror appeared. But he immediately suppressed it with willpower and lowered himself back down into his armchair. The prisoner, meanwhile, was continuing with his speech, yet the secretary was recording nothing more, and merely stretching his neck out like a goose, trying not to let slip a single word. "There you are. It's over," said the prisoner, casting benevolent glances at Pilate. "And I'm extremely pleased about that. I'd advise you, Hegemon, to leave the palace for a time, take a walk somewhere in the surrounding area, perhaps the gardens on the Mount of Olives. The storm will begin." The prisoner turned around and narrowed his eyes at the sun. "Later on, towards evening, the walk would do you a lot of good, and I would accompany you with pleasure. Certain new ideas have occurred to me that you might, I think, find interesting, and willingly share them with you, particularly as you give the impression of being a very intelligent man." The secretary turned deathly pale, dropped his scroll to the floor. "The trouble is," continued the bound man, whom nobody was stopping, "you're too self-contained, and you've utterly lost faith in your people. I mean, you must agree, you really shouldn't make a dog the sole object of your affection. Your life is a poor one, Hegemon." And at this point, the speaker permitted himself a smile. The secretary was thinking about only one thing now. Should he believe his own ears or not? He had to believe them. Then he tried to imagine in precisely what whimsical form of anger the hot-tempered procurator would express itself at this unheard-of impertinence from the prisoner. And this the secretary was unable to imagine. Even though he knew the procurator very well. At that moment there rang out the cracked, rather hoarse voice of the procurator, who said in Latin, "Untie his hands." One of the legionnaires in the escort struck his spear on the ground, handed it to another one, went forward and took the ropes off the prisoner. The secretary picked up the scroll and decided not to record anything for the time being, nor to be surprised at anything. "Confess. Are you a great doctor?" Pilate asked quietly in Greek. "No, procurator, I'm not a doctor," replied the prisoner, rubbing a twisted and swollen purple wrist in delight. From under his brows, Pilate's eyes bored sternly into the prisoner, and those eyes were no longer lackluster. The sparks that everyone knew had appeared in them. "I didn't ask you," said Pilate. "Perhaps you know Latin, too." "Yes, I do," replied the prisoner. Color appeared in Pilate's yellowish cheeks, and he asked now in Latin, "How did you happen to know that I wanted to call my dog?" "It's very simple," the prisoner replied in Latin. "You were moving your hand through the air," and the prisoner repeated Pilate's gesture, as though you wanted to stroke something. "And your lips?" "Yes," said Pilate. They were silent for a moment. Pilate asked a question in Greek. And so you are not a great healer? No, no, replied the prisoner animatedly. Believe me, I'm not a healer. All right. If you want to keep it a secret, do so. Has no direct bearing on the case. So you claim you didn't call on anyone to demolish or set fire to, or in any other way destroy the temple. I repeat, I haven't called upon anyone, Hegemon, to perform such acts. Do I seem feeble-minded? Oh, no. You don't seem at all feeble-minded, the procurator replied quietly and smiled a fearsome sort of smile. So swear, then, that it didn't happen. What would you have me swear on? Asked the unbound man, who was now very animated. Well, on your life, perhaps, replied the procurator. It's the very time to swear on it, since it hangs by a thread. Be aware of that. And do you think it was you that hung it up, Hegemon? Asked the prisoner. If so, you're very much mistaken. Pilate started and replied through his teeth. I can cut the thread. And you're mistaken about that, too, retorted the prisoner, smiling brightly and using his hand to shield himself from the sun. You must agree it's quite certain the thread can only be cut by the one who hung it up. Right, said Pilate, smiling. Now I have no doubt that the idle layabouts in Yerushalayim followed on your heels. I don't know who hung your tongue in place, but they certainly hung a quick one. Incidentally, tell me, is it true you entered Yerushalayim through the Susim gate, riding on an ass, and accompanied by a crowd of plebs who were shouting out greetings to you as though you were some kind of prophet? Here the procurator indicated the scroll of parchment. The prisoner looked at the procurator in bewilderment. I don't even have an ass, Hegemon, he said. I did indeed come into Yerushalayim through the Susim gate, but on foot, accompanied by Levi Matthew alone. Nobody shouted anything at me. Nobody in Yerushalayim knew me then. Do you know these people? Pilate continued without taking his eyes off the prisoners. A certain Dismas, a certain Gestas, and a third, Bar Rabban. I don't know these good people, replied the prisoner. Truly. And now tell me why it is you use the words good people all the time. You call everyone that, do you? Everyone, replied the prisoner. There are no evil people in the world. First I've heard of it. But perhaps I don't know enough about life. No need to record any further, he addressed the secretary, although the latter had been recording nothing anyway. Then continued saying to the prisoner, Did you read about it in some Greek book or another? No, I came to this conclusion with my own mind. And that is what you preach, yes? And so, for example, Centurion Marcus, he's nicknamed the Rat Catcher. Is he good? Yes. He's an unhappy man, it's true. Since good people disfigured him, he's become cruel and callous. I wonder who it was that mutilated him. I can readily tell you that, responded Pilate, for I was a witness to it. Good people were falling upon him like dogs on a bear. Teutons had hold of his neck, his arms, his legs. An infantry menopile had walked into a trap, and if the cavalry term which I was commanding hadn't hacked its way in from the flank, then you, philosopher, would not have had occasion to converse with the rat catcher. It was at the battle of Itzavizio, in the Valley of the Virgins. If I could have a talk with him, said the prisoner dreamily all of a sudden, I'm sure he'd change. dramatically. I imagine, responded Pilate, you'd bring the legate of the legion little joy if you took it into your head to talk with any of his officers or soldiers. It won't happen, however, luckily for everyone. I'll be the first to see to that. At that moment, a swallow flew speedily onto the colonnade, circled beneath the gold ceiling, descended, almost caught its sharp wing on the face of a bronze statue in a niche, and disappeared behind the capital of the column. Perhaps it was thinking of making a nest there. In the duration of its flight, a formula had now taken shape in the newly lightened head of the procurator. It was this: the Hegemon has heard the case of the vagrant philosopher Yeshua, also known as Ha-Nazri, and failed to find corpus delicti. In particular, he has failed to find the slightest link between the actions of Yeshua and the disturbances that have recently taken place in Jerusalem. The vagrant philosopher has turned out to be mentally ill. Consequently, the procurator does not confirm the death sentence pronounced on Ha-Nazri by the Lesser Sanhedrin. But in view of the fact that Ha-Nazri's mad utopian speeches could be the cause of unrest in Jerusalem, the procurator is removing Yeshua from Jerusalem and will subject him to imprisonment in Caesarea Strato on the Mediterranean Sea. That is, in the very place where the procurator's residence is. It only remained to dictate this to the secretary. The swallow's wings crackled just above the Hegemon's head. The bird sped towards the bowl of the fountain and flew out to freedom. The procurator raised his eyes to the prisoner and saw that a column of dust was suddenly ablaze beside him. "Is that all there is about him?" asked Pilate, and frowned. "Unfortunately not," the secretary replied, and handed Pilate another piece of parchment. "What else is there?" After reading what had been handed him, his countenance changed still more. It may have been that dark blood had flooded into his neck and his face, or something else may have happened. His skin lost its yellow tinge, grew brown, and his eyes appeared to sink. And again, it was probably the fault of his blood, which had flooded into his temples and began pounding inside them. Only something happened to the procurator's vision. And so it seemed to him that the prisoner's head had floated off somewhere, and another had appeared in its place. On this bald head sat a sparsely toothed golden crown. On the forehead was a round sore that was eating away at the skin and was smeared with ointment. A sunken, toothless mouth with a willful, drooping lower lip. It seemed to Pilate that the pink columns of the balcony and the roofs of Jerusalem down below in the distance, beyond the garden, had disappeared, and everything around them was submerged in the dense verdure of the gardens of Capri. Something strange had happened to his hearing, too. Trumpets seemed to sound, low, threatening in the distance, and a nasal voice was heard very distinctly, haughtily drawling out the words, "The law of lèse majesty." His thoughts raced brief, incoherent, and extraordinary. He's done for. And then, we're done for. And among them was one utterly absurd, one about some sort of immortality. And immortality, for some reason, provoked at this moment in him unbearable anguish. Pilate tensed, drove the vision out, returned his gaze to the balcony, and before him again were the eyes of the prisoner. "Listen, Ha-Nazri," the procurator began, giving Yeshua a strange sort of look. The procurator's face was threatening, but the eyes were alarmed. "Have you ever said anything about the great Caesar? Answer. Have you, or have you not? Pilate drew out the word not, rather more than one ought to at a trial, and sent to Yeshua in his gaze a particular thought which he seemed to want to suggest to the prisoner. Telling the truth is easy and pleasant, remarked the prisoner. I don't need to know, responded Pilate in a choked, angry voice. If you find telling the truth pleasant or unpleasant, you will have to tell it. But when speaking away every word, if you don't want not only inevitable, but also agonizing death. No one knows what happened to the procurator of Judea, but he allowed himself to raise a hand as though shielding himself from a ray of sunlight. And behind that hand, as a shield, to send the prisoner a look with some sort of hint in it. And so, he said, answer. Do you know a certain Judas from Caiaphas? And what precisely did you say to him, if you did say anything about Caesar? It was like this, the prisoner willingly began recounting. In the evening the day before yesterday, I met a young man outside the temple who gave his name as Judas from the town of Caiaphas. He had invited me to his home in the lower town and showed me much hospitality. A good man? Asked Pilate, a devilish light glinting in his eyes. A very good, very inquisitive man, the prisoner confirmed. He showed the greatest interest in my ideas, received me most cordially. Lit the lamps, said Pilate through gritted teeth in the same tone as the prisoner, and yet his eyes were glimmering as he did so. Yes, continued Yeshua, a little surprised at how well informed the procurator was. He asked me to set out my opinion on the power of the state. He was extremely interested in that question. And so what did you say? Asked Pilate. Or will you reply that you've forgotten what you've said? And yet there was already a hopelessness in Pilate's tone. Among other things, the prisoner recounted, I said that any sort of power is coercion of the people, that the time will come when there will be no power, neither of the Caesars nor of any other sort of authority. Man will move on to the kingdom of truth and justice, where no kind of power will be needed at all. And after that? No, there was nothing after that, said the prisoner. At that point, people began running in. They started tying me up and led me off to prison. The secretary, trying not to miss a single word, was rapidly scribbling the words down on the parchment. There has never been in all the world, is not, and never shall be, a greater and finer power for the people than the power of the Emperor Tiberius, waxed Pilate's cracked and sick voice. For some reason the procurator was looking with hatred at the secretary and the escort. And it is not for you, mad criminal, to deliberate about it. At this point Pilate exclaimed, Dismiss the escort from the balcony. Turning to the secretary, he added, Leave me alone with the criminal. It's a matter of state here. The escort lifted their spears, and with their metal-shod caligay pounded rhythmically, they went from the balcony into the garden, and their secretary followed too. The silence on the balcony was for some time broken only by the song of the water in the fountain. Pilate could see the disk of water swelling at the top of the pipe, its edges breaking off, dropping down in little streams. The prisoner was the first to speak. I can see that something bad has happened because of my talking with the young man from Caiaphas. I have a premonition, Hegemon, that he will suffer some misfortune, and I feel very sorry for him. I think, replied the procurator with a strange grin, there's someone else in the world you ought to feel more sorry for than Judas from Caiaphas, and who will have a much worse time of it than Judas. And so Marcus the rat-catcher, a cold and confirmed butcher, the people who, as I can see, the procurator indicated Yeshua's disfigured face, beat you for your sermons, the villains Dismas and Gestas, who, with their gang, killed 4 soldiers, and finally the filthy traitor Judas. They're all good people. Yes, replied the prisoner. And the kingdom of truth will come. It will, Hegemon, replied Yeshua with conviction. It will never come, Pilate suddenly shouted, in such a terrible voice that Yeshua staggered backwards. Thus, many years before in the Valley of the Virgins, Pilate had shouted to his horsemen the words, "Cut them down, cut them down. Rat-catcher the giant's been caught." Once more he raised his voice, cracked by commands, yelling out the words so they were heard in the garden, "Criminal, criminal, criminal." And then, lowering his voice, he asked, "Yeshua ha-Nosri, do you believe in any gods?" "There is one God," replied Yeshua. "I believe in him." "Then pray to him. Pray as hard as you can." Still, at this point, Pilate's voice sank. "It won't help." "You have no wife?" asked Pilate mournfully somehow, as if not understanding what was happening to him. "No, I'm alone." "Hateful city," the procurator suddenly muttered for some reason, and flexed his shoulders as if he were cold, and rubbed his hands as though washing them. "If you'd been murdered before your meeting with Judas from Caiaphas, truly it would have been better." "You could release me, Hegemon," the prisoner unexpectedly requested, and his voice became uneasy. "I can see they want to kill me." A spasm distorted Pilate's face. He turned the inflamed, red-veined whites of his eyes to Yeshua and said, "Do you suppose you unfortunate man, that the Roman procurator will release someone who has said what you have said? Oh, gods! Or do you think I'm prepared to take your place? I don't share your ideas, and listen to me. If from this moment you utter so much as a word, start talking to anyone, beware of me. I repeat to you, beware." "Hegemon." "Silence!" exclaimed Pilate, and his furious gaze followed the swallow that had again fluttered onto the balcony. "To me," shouted Pilate. And when the secretary and the escort had returned to their places, Pilate announced that he was indeed ratifying the death sentence pronounced at the meeting of the Lesser Sanhedrin on the criminal Yeshua ha-Nosri, and the secretary recorded what Pilate said. A minute later, Marcus the rat-catcher stood before the procurator. The procurator ordered him to hand the criminal over to the chief of the Secret Service, and at the same time to convey to him the procurator's order that Yeshua ha-Nosri be kept apart from the other condemned men, and also that the Secret Service detachment be forbidden, on pain of severe punishment, to converse with Yeshua about anything whatsoever, or to reply to any of his questions. At a sign from Marcus, the escort closed up around Yeshua and led him off the balcony. Next in front of the procurator appeared a handsome man with a blond beard and eagle's feathers in the crest of his helmet, with gold lions' faces glittering on his chest, gold studs on his sword belt, wearing triple-soled boots laced to the knees, the crimson cloak thrown over his left shoulder. This was the legate in command of the legion. The procurator asked where the Sebastian cohort was now. The legate reported that its men were forming a cordon on the square in front of the hippodrome, where the criminals' sentences would be announced to the people. Then the procurator gave orders for the legate to detail 2 sentries from the Roman cohort. One of them, under the command of the rat-catcher, was to escort the criminals, the carts, with the instruments of execution and the executioners when they departed for the Bald Mountain, and when they arrived there, to form the upper cordon. The other one was to be sent to Bald Mountain straight away, and was to begin cordoning it off immediately. To the same end, that is, to guard the mount, the procurator asked the legate to send an auxiliary cavalry regiment, the Syrian Allah. When the legate had left the balcony, the procurator ordered the secretary to invite the president of the Sanhedrin, 2 of its members, and the chief of Yerushalayim's temple guard into the palace, but added as he did so that he would like things arranged in such a way that he could speak with the president in advance and in private before the conference with all of these people. The procurator's order was carried out quickly and precisely, and the sun, which was burning Yerushalayim with an extraordinary sort of frenzy during these days, had not yet had time to approach its highest point, when, on the upper terrace of the garden, by the 2 white marble lions guarding the steps, the procurator and the acting president of the Sanhedrin, the high priest of Judea, Joseph Caiaphas, met. It was quiet in the garden, but having emerged from under the colonnade into the garden's sun-drenched upper courtyard, with its palm trees on monstrous elephantine legs, once there opened up before the procurator the whole of the Yerushalayim he hated, with its suspension bridges, forts, and most importantly the block of marble that beggared all description, with the golden dragon scales instead of a roof, the temple of Yerushalayim. The procurator detected with his sharp hearing, far off and down below, where a stone wall separated the lower terraces of the palace garden from the city square, a low rumbling, above which at times there would soar up, faint and shrill, what could have been either groans or cries. The procurator realized that there in the square an innumerable crowd of Yerushalayim's inhabitants had already gathered, stirred up by the recent disturbances, and that this crowd was awaiting with impatience the pronouncement of sentence, and that shouting among it were restless water sellers. The procurator began by inviting the high priest onto the balcony to take shelter from the pitiless heat, but Caiaphas apologized politely, explained he could not do that on the eve of a feast. Pilate threw a hood over his slightly balding head and began a conversation. The conversation was conducted in Greek. Pilate said that he had heard the case of Yeshua ha-Nozri and had ratified the death sentence. Thus, sentenced to execution, which was to be carried out that day, were 3 villains, Dismas, Gestas, and Ba-Rabban, and in addition this Yeshua ha-Nozri. The first 2, who had taken into their heads to incite the people to revolt against Caesar, had been taken by force by the Roman authorities, and they were in the domain of the procurator, and consequently they would not be under discussion here. But the latter 2, Ba-Rabban and ha-Nozri, had been seized by local authorities and condemned by the Sanhedrin. In accordance with the law and in accordance with custom, one of these 2 criminals would have to be set free in honor of the great feast of Passover that was starting that day. And so the procurator wished to know which of the 2 criminals the Sanhedrin intended to free, Ba-Rabban or ha-Nozri. The Sanhedrin requests the release of Ba-Rabban. The procurator knew very well the high priest would reply to him in precisely this way, but his task was to show that such a reply elicited his astonishment. Pilate did just that with great artistry. The brows on his haughty face rose, and the procurator looked in surprise straight into the high priest's eyes. "I confess that reply has amazed me," began the procurator gently. "Afraid there may be a misunderstanding here." Pilate explained himself. The Roman authorities were not encroaching in any way on the rights of the local spiritual authorities. The high priest was well aware of that, but in this instance an obvious mistake was being made. And the Roman authorities did, of course, have an interest in the correction of that mistake. In truth, the crimes of Bar Rabban and Ha-Nosri were quite incomparable in gravity. If the latter, an obvious madman, was guilty of the utterance of absurd speeches which had stirred up in the people of Jerusalem and several other places, the former was much more significantly burdened. Not only had he permitted himself direct calls to revolt, he had also killed a guard during attempts to capture him. Bar Rabban was incomparably more dangerous than Ha-Nosri. On the strength of all he had set out, the procurator requested that the high priest review the decision and leave at liberty the less harmful of the two condemned men, and that, without doubt, was Ha-Nosri. And so, Caiaphas said in a quiet but firm voice that the Sanhedrin had familiarized itself with the case quite carefully, and was reporting for the second time that it intended to free Bar Rabban. What? Even after my pleading? The pleading of a man in whose person speaks the power of Rome? High priest repeated a third time. And for the third time I report that we are freeing Bar Rabban, said Caiaphas quietly. It was all over. There was nothing more to talk about. Ha-Nosri was going away forever, and there was no one to cure the procurator's terrible, vicious headaches. There was no remedy for them but death. But this was not the thought that struck Pilate now. It was still the same incomprehensible anguish which had already visited him on the balcony, that was permeating his entire being. He immediately tried to explain it, and the explanation was strange indeed. The procurator had the vague feeling there was something he had not finished saying to the condemned man, and something he had not finished hearing. Pilate banished this thought, and it flew away in an instant. Just as it had come, it flew away, but the anguish remained unexplained, for it could not possibly be explained by the other brief thought that came in a flash, like lightning, but that was extinguished straight away. Immortality. Immortality has come. Whose immortality had come? That the procurator did not understand. That the thought of this mysterious immortality that made him turn cold, even in the full blaze of the sun. Very well, said Pilate. So be it. At this point he looked around, took in at a glance the world that was visible to him, and was amazed at the change that had taken place. The bush laden with roses had vanished. The cypresses that fringed the upper terrace had vanished, as had the pomegranate tree, and the white statue in the verdure itself. In place of it all, some sort of dense crimson mush began floating around. Seaweed began to sway about it, and then was moved off somewhere, and Pilate himself moved off with it, too. Now he was being borne away, smothered and scorched by the most terrible rage, the rage of impotence. I feel stifled, said Pilate. I feel stifled. With a cold, moist hand, he ripped the clasp from the neckband of his cloak, and the clasp fell onto the sand. It's close today. There's a thunderstorm somewhere, responded the Caiaphas, not taking his eyes from the flushed face of the procurator, and foreseeing all his trials and tribulations yet to come. Oh, what a terrible month Nisan is this year. No, said Pilate, it's not because it's close. I've started feeling stifled with you Caiaphas. And narrowing his eyes, Pilate smiled and added, "Best take care of yourself, high priest." The high priest's dark eyes flashed, and he expressed surprise on his face no worse than the procurator had done earlier. "What am I hearing, procurator?" replied Caiaphas proudly and calmly. "Are you threatening me after a judgment that has been pronounced and ratified by you yourself? Is that possible? We are accustomed to the Roman procurator choosing his words before saying anything. Could anyone have heard us, Hegemon?" Pilate looked at the high priest with lifeless eyes and, baring his teeth, imitated a smile. Come, high priest. Who could possibly hear us now, here? Do you think I'm like the wandering young simpleton who's being executed today? Am I a boy, Caiaphas? I know what it is I'm saying, and where I'm saying it. The garden is cordoned off. The palace is cordoned off. Even a mouse couldn't get through a single crack. Not just a mouse either, even a, what's his name, from the town of Kiriath, couldn't get through. Incidentally, do you know such a man, high priest? Yes. If such a man got in here, he'd feel bitterly sorry for himself. You'll believe me on that score, of course. So be aware, then, that you, high priest, will get no peace from now on, neither you nor your people. And Pilate pointed into the distance to the right, where the temple was glowing on high. Is that I'm telling you this? It is I, Pontius Pilate, the horseman of the golden lance. I know, black-bearded Caiaphas replied fearlessly, and his eyes flashed. He raised his arms up towards the sky and continued, The Judaic people know you hate them with a fierce hatred and will cause them many sufferings. But you will not destroy them completely. God will protect them. And the all-powerful Caesar will hear, he will hear, and he will shield us from Pilate the destroyer. Oh no, exclaimed Pilate. And with every word he was finding things easier and easier. There was no need to pretend anymore. There was no need to pick his words. You've complained about me to Caesar too much. And now my hour has come, Caiaphas. Now word will fly from me, and not to the governor in Antioch, and not to Rome, but direct to pray to the emperor himself. Word of how you shelter notorious rebels from death in Jerusalem. And it won't be water from Solomon's pond, as I wanted for your benefit, that I'll be treating Jerusalem to then. No, not water. Remember how, because of you, I had to remove the shields with the emperor's monograms from the walls, relocate the troops. I had to come here myself, you see, to take a look at what was going on. Remember my word. You'll see not just one cohort here in Jerusalem, high priest, no. An entire Fulminata legion will advance right up to the walls of the city. The Arab cavalry will come up, and then you'll hear bitter crying and moaning. Then you'll remember this Ba Rabban that was saved, and you'll regret you sent the philosopher with his message of peace to his death. The high priest's face was covered in blotches. His eyes were burning. He, like the procurator, bared his teeth in a smile and replied, Do you believe what you're saying right now, procurator? No, you don't. It wasn't peace, not peace, that this seducer of the people brought to us here in Jerusalem, and you, horsemen, understand that very well. You wanted to release him so he would stir up the people, ridicule the faith, and deliver the people up to Roman swords. But I, the high priest of Judea, while I yet live, will not yield the faith up to profanation. I will protect the people. Do you hear, Pilate? And here Caiaphas raised his hand menacingly. Listen carefully, procurator. Caiaphas fell silent, and again the procurator heard what sounded like the roar of the sea, rolling up to the very walls of Herod the Great's garden. This roar rose up from below, to the feet and into the face of the procurator, and behind his back, there, beyond the wings of the palace, could be heard disquieting trumpet signals, the heavy crunch, hundreds of feet, the clanking of iron. Here the procurator realized that the Roman infantry was already setting out in accordance with his order, hastening to the final parade before the deaths of the terrified rebels and villains. "Do you hear, Procurator?" the high priest repeated quietly. "Will you really try and tell me that all that—" The high priest raised both arms, and the dark hood fell from his head. "Was provoked by the pitiful villain Bar-Rabban." The procurator wiped his damp, cold forehead with the back of his wrist, looked down at the ground, screwing his eyes up at the sky, saw the burning hot sphere was almost directly above his head, that the Caiaphas shadow had shrunk away completely by the lion's tail, and quietly and indifferently he said, "It's getting towards midday. We got carried away with our conversation. But in the meantime, we do need to carry on." Having apologized to the high priest in refined phrases, he asked him to take a seat on a bench in the shade of a magnolia. And wait while he summoned the remaining people required for a final brief conference and gave one more order concerning the execution. Caiaphas bowed politely, placing his hand upon his heart, and remained in the garden while Pilate returned to the balcony. There he ordered the waiting secretary to invite into the garden the legate of the legion, the tribune of the cohort, and also the 2 members of the Sanhedrin, and the commander of the temple guard, who were awaiting a summons on the lower terrace of the garden in a circular pavilion with a fountain. To this Pilate added that he would himself be coming out into the garden straightway too. Then he withdrew into the interior of the palace. While the secretary was convening the conference, the procurator had a meeting in a room obscured from the sun by dark blinds, with some sort of man was a face half covered by a hood. Through the rays of the sun could not possibly have troubled him inside the room. This meeting was extremely brief. The procurator said a few quiet words to the man, after which the latter withdrew, while Pilate went through the colonnade into the garden. There, in the presence of all those who had wished to see, the procurator solemnly and dryly confirmed that he was ratifying Yeshua ha-Nosri's death sentence, and he inquired officially the members of the Sanhedrin as to which of the prisoners they would like to let live. On receiving reply that it was Bar-Rabban, the procurator said, "Very well," and ordered the secretary to enter into the minutes straightway, squeezed in his hand the clasp that the secretary had picked up from the sand, and said solemnly, "It's time." At this point, all those present moved off down beyond the broad marble steps, between walls of roses giving off a heavy scent, descending lower and lower towards the palace wall, towards the gates leading out into a large, smoothly paved square, at the end of which were visible the columns and statues of Jerusalem's stadium. As soon as the group had emerged from the garden into the square and gone up onto an extensive stone platform that dominated it, Pilate, looking around through narrowed eyelids, assessed the situation. The space he had just crossed, that is, the space between the palace wall and the platform, was empty, whereas in front of him, Pilate could no longer see the square. It had been devoured by the crowd, which would have flooded both onto the platform itself and into the cleared space, if a triple row of Sebastian's soldiers to Pilate's left hand, and soldiers of the Etruscan auxiliary cohort to the right had not held it back. And so Pilate went up onto the platform, squeezing the unnecessary clasp mechanically in his fist and squinting. The procurator was squinting not because the sun was stinging his eyes, no. For some reason he did not want to see the group of the condemned men who, as he very well knew, would be led up after him onto the platform in just a moment. As soon as the white cloak of the crimson lining rose up on high the stone cliff, at the edge of a human sea, a wave of sound struck the unseen Pilate's ears. It began softly, rising somewhere in the distance near the hippodrome, then became thunderous. and, after being sustained for several seconds, began to abate. "They've seen me," thought the procurator. Before the wave reached its lowest point, it unexpectedly began to develop again, and as it rolled, it rose higher than the first one, and on the second wave, just as foam rages on a roller at the sea, there raged a whistling and the individual moans of women, discernible through the thunder. "They've led them onto the platform," thought Pilate, "and the moans are because a number of women were crushed when the crowd surged forward." He waited for a time, aware that no power could make the crowd fall quiet until it had exhaled all that it had accumulated within it and fallen silent itself. And when that moment came, the procurator threw up his right arm, and the last sounds were expelled from the crowd. Then Pilate gathered as much of the hot air as he could into his chest and shouted, and his cracked voice carried over thousands of heads, "In the name of the Emperor Caesar." At this point, his ears were struck several times by an abrupt iron cry. In the cohorts, tossing up their spears and insignia, the soldiers cried out fearsomely, "Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar!" Pilate threw back his head and turned it straight towards the sun. Green fire flared up beneath his eyelids, which made his brain ignite, and above the crowd flew hoarse Aramaean words. 4 criminals, arrested in Jerusalem for murders, incitement to revolt, and assault on the laws of faith, are sentenced to a shameful punishment, hanging on posts. And now this punishment will be carried out on Bald Mountain. The names of the criminals are Dismas, Gestas, Ba-Raban, and Ha-Nosri. Here they are before you. Pilate pointed to the right, not seeing any criminals, but knowing they were there, in the place where they were required to be. The crowd answered with a long hum, as though of surprise or relief. And when it had died away, Pilate continued, "But only 3 of them will be executed. For in accordance with the law and custom in honor of the feast of Passover, one of the condemned men, chosen by the Lesser Sanhedrin, and with the ratification of Roman authorities, is to have his contemptible life restored to him by the magnanimous Emperor Caesar." Pilate shouted out the words, and at the same time listened to the way the humming was replaced by a great, heavy silence. And now not a sigh, not a rustling reached his ears. There even came a moment when it seemed to Pilate that everything absolutely vanished around him. The city he hated had died. He stood alone, scorched by the rays of the sun, his face digging into the sky. Pilate continued to hold the silence, and then began shouting out, "The name of the man who will now be released to freedom before you is..." He paused once again, delaying the name, checking that he had said everything, because he knew the dead city would rise again after the lucky man's name had been uttered, and no further words would be able to be heard. "Is that all?" Pilate whispered to himself soundlessly. "It is the name." And rolling the letter R over the silent city, he cried, "Ba-Raban." At this point to him it seemed that the sun, with a ringing sound, burst above him and flooded his ears with fire. In that fire raged a roaring, screams, moans, chuckling, and whistling. Pilate turned and set off back along the platform towards the steps, looking at nothing but the multicolored blocks of the flooring beneath his feet, so as not to stumble. He knew that now, behind his back, bronze coins and dates were falling like hail onto the platform. People in the howling crowd were climbing onto shoulders, crushing one another, to see a miracle with their own eyes. A man who had already been in the hands of death, tearing free of those hands, to see legionnaires taking the ropes off him, involuntarily causing him burning pain in arms dislocated during the interrogation, to see him frowning and gasping, but all the same smiling a senseless, mad smile. He knew that at this very same time, the escort was already leading the three with their hands bound towards the side steps to take them out onto the road leading to the west, out of the city towards Bald Mountain. Only when he found himself behind the platform in its rear did Pilate open his eyes, knowing that he was now out of danger. No longer could he see the condemned men. With the moaning of the crowd, which was beginning to fall quiet already, were mingled the readily discernible piercing cries of the public criers, repeating, some in Aramaic, others in Greek, everything the procurator had shouted from the platform. The staccato clatter of approaching horses' hoofs reached his ears too, and a trumpet trumpeting something briefly and merrily. In reply to these sounds, from the roofs of houses on the street leading out into the bazaar, into the square of the hippodrome, came the piercing whistling of little boys and cries of, "Look out!" The solitary soldier standing in the cleared space of the square with a standard in his hand waved it in alarm, and then the procurator, the legate of the legion, and the secretary and the escort stopped. The cavalry, Allah, working up ever more of a canter, flew out into the square and cut across one side of it, passing the throng of people by, and to gallop by the shortest route down a lane, beside the stone wall, and with a vine creeping over it, to Bald Mountain. On drawing level with Pilate, the fast-trotting commander of the Allah, a Syrian as small as a boy and dark, shouted something shrilly and drew his sword from its scabbard. The wild black lathered horse shied and reared up on its hind legs. Thrusting the sword into its scabbard, the commander struck the horse across the neck with a lash, straightened it up, and rode into the lane, moving into a gallop. After him, in a cloud of dust, flew the horsemen in rows of three. The ends of their light bamboo lances began to bounce, and past the procurator sped faces that seemed especially swarthy under their white turbans, and with cheerfully bared, gleaming teeth. Raising the dust to the sky, the Allah burst into the lane, and last to ride past Pilate was a soldier with a trumpet that burned in the sun behind his back. Shielding himself from the dust with his hand, and with a discontented frown on his face, Pilate moved onwards, heading for the gates of the palace garden, and the legate, the secretary, and the escort moved off after him. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. That's the end of the chapter. It's an interesting retelling, a fictitious retelling of a possibly fictitious series of events. One that casts Pilate in a more favorable light, I suppose. I enjoyed it. If you like that, like the rest of the book too, although that chapter kind of stands alone. And I hope that you all have a lovely Christmas or holiday, whatever you're celebrating. And a good night, and I will talk to you all soon.